Rasti jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljo ravnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvom rudaru i tvome rataru, mir graditelju i tvom čuvaru, mir tvojoj sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita.
Yeah.
ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Răsună Good evening, everybody, and welcome. You join me today for a exciting event. It's going to be an election special. If you're tuning in from foreign parts and aren't aware of what's been going on, we here in the mother of all democracies, that's a title which apparently belongs to us, not to you Americans, are having, or I should say, perhaps more accurately, enduring a bourgeois democratic election. And oh, what fun we are having. So, I will get to the grisly details in just a moment, but I want to start by tapping into perhaps something more positive to say to begin with, and then I will outline a basic thesis to you, which I'm going to be using to explain tonight's results. So, I will now read to you from one of the high points, I think, of the revolutionary struggle in the bourgeois sense in this country, all the way back in the 1640s. And this is from the Putney debates, and these are the words of Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, one of the most radical, leveler-aligned leaders in the New Model Army. And this reads as follows. For really, I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he has not had a voice to put himself under. And I read that to start off with, because of course the demand of radical movements from this period onwards was, in the bourgeois period, was for representation, was for the social contract view of things, which means that you have to consent in order that you can be ruled effectively. The only effective rule comes through that which the governed consents to, formally or informally. And this, in the view of the levelers, had to come through universal manhood suffrage. In the view of the diggers, of course, the much more radical end of the movements that were in existence back in the 1640s and 50s, it meant the distribution of all land to those who worked it in a sort of a form of Christian communism, akin to Thomas Munzer's Anabaptists. And the words of Rainsborough, though, start as more on the social contract tradition. Social contract tradition embodied in people like, well, arguably Thomas Hobbes, definitely John Locke, definitely Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There's a whole book he wrote entitled just that. And later on, the liberals of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, who was infamously disparaged by Marx. And again, the idea being this central bourgeois idea, as in the rights of the bourgeoisie being defended against absolutism, that if there was to be taxation, that there had to be, to use the American terminology, representation. Because, of course, the English Revolution was, to a large degree, about checking the arbitrary power of the absolutist monarch to levy taxes, to quarter men inside private domiciles. That was another reason for the rebellion, and to threaten property rights. So the idea being that the government has to be accountable. And if it is not accountable and if it becomes a tyranny, you have a right to rebellion. So that's a bourgeois idea. It also heavily influences working class radicalism in this country, in Britain. And this is what you find in the earlier period running up to 1789, prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution, and then slightly afterwards as well into the Napoleonic Wars, is this demand that Parliament be more representative. And then later, immediately after the Napoleonic Wars are concluded, after 1815, you have an upsurge of working class radicalism following years of dictatorship, open dictatorship waged by various different governments as the Napoleonic Wars were waged. And this upsurge of class struggle, particularly where I'm speaking to you from now in the English Northwest, leads to climactic encounters with armed soldiery in places like St. Peter's Field Manchester and the killing of many. But what the demand of those radicals was that the franchise be extended. Again, they were focusing on manhood suffrage back then, free of property qualification. And again, with the Chartists, we get the insistence that the working class has to be included in the parliamentary system. And this is a tradition in this country. The idea being that there is a sacred, eternal English or British liberty. I mean, these are national mythologies mainly, that the working class is entitled to tap into. And this animates a lot of working class radicalism in the early to middle 19th century and remains a bias in the working class movement all the way up to the later 19th century. This idea that there is a parliament that if we can have access to it, we can get redress to our grievances. And it's an idea that actually goes back even further. It goes back all the way to the Peasants' Revolt itself, 1381, which is a tremendously militant and often violent movement that terrorized the lawyers, as the old song goes, and forced John of Gaunt out of his palace, terrorized the bigwigs and the aristocrats of London, but was diffused by a clever negotiating tactic run by the king and his advisors, which is pretending to issue a new Charter of Rights, pretending to negotiate with them, but in actual fact, luring them into a negotiation and have then the Lord Mayor of London, William of Walworth, killed Wat Tyler, the peasants' leader. Now, what that movement, all the way back then, was asking for was that the king would hear the peasants' grievances and would address them. And so there is this very long tradition that a lot of reformists like to mention favorably of the working class issuing a remonstrance, issuing a demand for redress. So that is a tradition which was carried on and forwarded by the working class in the 19th century. And so therefore it shouldn't be a surprise that as the English bourgeois learnt how to concede without giving up power, that this demand increased to the point where we did eventually get universal manhood and then universal suffrage regardless of sex or property qualification. The first election held under those terms, i.e. no more discrimination against women and no more discrimination, i.e. barring of voting rights based on property qualifications, was the election in 1929. So that's not too long ago in the grand scheme of things. It's less than 100 years ago. And what becomes obvious, and this is a point that if you've been listening or watching this program for a while, you'll have heard me talk about this before. The ruling class in Britain, because it's the oldest continually existing capitalist class in the world, again, as I've said before, there's an argument that the Republic of Venice was actually the first capitalist nation, but that broke up before it could come into its imperialist glory, shall we say, in the capitalist era. But the British capitalist class are the oldest ruling capitalist class in the world, oldest continually existing capitalist country in the world, oldest imperialist power. So they are long practiced at tricks, and therefore they learn how to push the centres of power away from where they had previously been when the working class got the vote. And so they learnt how to drain power away from Parliament and into the cabinet. Or cabinet of ministers, if you prefer, and then later on learnt how to drain that power away from the cabinet and purely into the office of the Prime Minister, and then from the office of the Prime Minister disperse it into the permanent bureaucracy and the Bank of England. And you, at each stage, of course, this corresponds to various different stages in the class war. So, because we are now a late stage example of decaying monopoly capitalism, we have an extreme case of bureaucratism. And by bureaucratism, I don't mean that we have a gigantic and colossal bureaucracy. It's still a sizable bureaucracy in this country, but what I mean is the way that decisions are taken has been bureaucratized. And why is this a necessity for imperialism? It's a necessity for imperialism for a number of reasons. First of all, you don't want the political process that you've had to allow the working class to have access to be able to infringe upon the operations of imperialism. Giant monopoly capitalist corporations need to be free from scrutiny. They need to be free to conduct their business and not be looking over their shoulder at a angry and militant working class who's realized that they're getting scammed. So they need a decision-making process which is streamlined, which is effective, which gives them everything that they would want and has the minimum of oversight. The British system is perfect for that. It was already designed that way. And the other reason why they need zero scrutiny is because they need things to happen rapidly for them, especially in this time. So what you need in the case of Britain, and this equally applies to the United States, is that you need the central bank in this era of late-stage imperialism to be able to make very rapid decisions over interest rates and over things like quantitative easing that came in after 2008. And you need to be able to do that free from scrutiny, with not even the bare minimum of scrutiny that used to exist when, for instance, the power over interest rates nominally belonged to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, our version of the finance minister. One of the first things that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did was to, at great applause from the bourgeois press, was to make sure that that power got passed to the governor of the Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee, just as the same thing happens with the Federal Reserve in the United States. And the reason why they wanted that is because they want as many of these decisions as possible to be completely outside of scrutiny. For a while in the social democratic period, which still hangs over us like an albatross these days, we have a population that is increasingly disillusioned. But what you find when you do any campaigning is that for all that people are angry and disillusioned and have had enough of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, no matter what the result ends up being tonight, the people still default back, but I think possibly more older people than the Zoomers, to the idea that the state should be there to provide a certain standard of living, should be there to, as we said before about the earlier revolts, should be there to redress grievances. And that idea is very strong amongst those who grew up in the post-war welfare capitalist period. And it's a prejudice that's going to be rather hard to shake. I think Keir Starmer will do his best to destroy it, though. So the point about all of this is the monopoly capitalists need as many decisions as possible to be taken away from areas of scrutiny. For a while, because they had to make concessions after World War II, there were certain amounts of decisions that were still made in Parliament and in Cabinet. But one of the things they did in the Thatcher period was make sure that all of that got wrapped up. So in the under the name of efficiency, under the name of expertise, under the name of trusting the experts, remember that one, these decisions over various different important matters get devolved into various bureaucracies, be it in the Bank of England for interest rates, be it in the permanent bureaucracy of the civil service, or various what we call non-departmental public bodies, which are agencies that used to be part of the central civil service, which are spun off. And so when you're looking at how Britain's actually governed as a late-stage imperialist country, what you see is that as many decisions as possible are taken away from even the pathetic representatives or elected representatives who are wholly, of course, devoted to the imperialist ideology. But of course, because they are elected representatives, there's always the slight risk that one of them might take it into their heads that they want to do something. They want to actually govern the country themselves. I mean, I know this is sounding like a Yes Minister episode, but the reason why that is so funny is because there is so much of it that is still so true. And this, of course, is the miserable fate that befell Liz Truss, our late and unlamented Prime Minister, who actually thought that she might want to govern the country in some ways and was defenestrated rather rapidly, to the great applause of the established British left, mistakenly so, in my view. But again, this is the situation that you have to keep in mind when looking at a British election. We are a late-stage imperialist country. We have an economy which is run by very parasitic monopoly capital. And we've had a working class that's been on the losing end of a class war since the early 1980s at the very least. We have very weak trade unions in this country. We have a trade union leadership which is almost entirely incorporated into the management structures of the state. And we have no difference whatsoever between the two major parties and most of the minor parties as well. All committed to NATO, all committed to the Ukraine war, all fundamentally committed to continuing the war in Gaza, all committed to aggression against Russia, all committed to aggression against China, other than like a few independents. That's true from everybody, from the Greens through to the Tories, with of course Labour and the Liberals there as well. And also the Scottish Nationalists are also committed to the EU and to NATO. The Welsh nationalists used to pretend to be different, but they're really not that much different. So you have complete unanimity on all major questions. You have some slight deviations on like some of the parties that had something of a social democratic tradition might still, like the Greens, like the SNP, will still periodically squeak something about more progressive forms of taxation or something like that, but they'll never be able to do it, even if they got into a coalition government. They will be handed an agenda. They will be handed an agenda that is acceptable to the ruling class, which is, of course, why Labour and the Tories, the two largest parties, are almost exactly aligned. This is what the ruling class want. They don't want the disturbance. They have to allow you to look as if you have a voice, but in reality, your vote is rendered meaningless as soon as you put the cross in the box. There's no meaning to it now. The Chartists and others who thought that they were fighting for representation and access to Parliament, just as later on, like the early founders of what became the Labour Party, those early working class MPs, thought they were getting access to a chamber where decisions would be made, only to find that the ruling class had cleverly circumvented that before they got in there. And now we're in a much later period. You can see that there's almost no possibility of pushing any kind of agenda through there. So let's go back to the quote from Thomas Rainsborough. If we use this logic of the social contract and the idea of you putting yourself under a government by consent, can we argue, even if we adopt a liberal point of view, is this something which exists here? And the argument that I would come back with, even if we view this purely as sort of a liberal, in a liberal way, if you analyse where the centres of power are, you can't argue that Parliament is an actual centre of power now, because it's not. Again, like, this doesn't take a particularly Marxist-Leninist analysis to see that. You can see that just by looking at the way the country's been governed since the financial crisis, since the global recession began in 2008. You can just, again, do an institutional analysis. Just look at the way that changes have been made in the way that the Parliament is run, in the way that decisions are taken more and more, first in Cabinet, then in the Prime Minister's office, then just by the Prime Minister and a tiny group of unelected advisors. And then, of course, who is advising them? Why, it's the permanent bureaucracy and various representatives of, shall we say, interested parties. Like, power has drained away from bourgeois democratic institutions for decades. Even liberal scholars will admit that. So this election really is meaningless. It's completely meaningless. Late stage capitalism renders elections like this completely meaningless, because it's between it's a stacked deck. It's between representatives of wholly owned and controlled political parties that are completely under the control of the bourgeoisie. The only people who are going to tell you that Labour and the Tories are offering different things from each other are paid hacks for either side, or professional liars like Dave Ward of the Communication Workers Union, a man who isn't stupid, but has been going around telling people that Labour will save our NHS. Well, tell that to Wesley Streeting, because he's certainly not operating on that agenda. The Labour will provide justice for unfairly sacked workers. When has the Labour Party done that? The Labour Party didn't do that in 13 years in power, from 97 to 2010. They're certainly not going to do it under Sir Keir Starmer. And Sir Keir Starmer, of course, lest we forget, has been embraced by the most parasitic elements of British capitalism, has been embraced by the most powerful elements of US imperialism, namely our friends at BlackRock. A certain Mr. Larry Fink endorsed Starmer, saying he gave Larry a great feeling of hope. Of course he does. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, revealed her hand on this, and Labour Party's hand, when she went over and met with representatives of BlackRock and other major US imperialists, and basically offered to mortgage the country to them. That's the way they're going to do their investments in the public sector. They're going to do it in an even worse version of the old PFI schemes, which you've heard me talk about before, so I won't rehash that argument here. But essentially, it's a way of mortgaging off large elements of the public sector, large elements of the state, and essentially putting it in the hands of the BlackRocks of the world and others, and then the state then leases it back from them on a 30-year plus mortgage. Now, this happened a lot with various public sector buildings from the 90s all the way through to the current day. But the ones that were done in the ones that were built in the last Labour administration, including a lot of schools and hospitals, were so poorly built that they're falling apart within a decade. So you're paying a 30-year mortgage on something that's falling to pieces. And every single element in the public sector, from the catering to the cleaning to the IT contracts, it's all outsourced and it's all offshored quite a lot of the time, the management of it at least. And so it's done as cheaply as possible by workers with as few rights as the outsourced employer can get away with. And again, this is Labour's plan to mortgage off even more of the public sector that's still left. Now, there's an argument going around about, you can see the likes of that scumbag Paul Mason saying, oh, well, Labour's not going to sell off the NHS. How dare you spread misinformation? No, there's not. They're not going to bring a bill into Parliament called the NHS sell-off bill. That would be, unless they're really stupid, because that would generate too much opposition too quickly. They're just going to carry on the way that they've been going for the last 25 years, which is allowing private companies to drain resources out of the NHS, to drain money out of the NHS, constantly bleeding it white, so to speak, whilst at the same time boosting the private sector and pushing more customers towards private healthcare, and boosting private healthcare again because people get on long NHS waiting lists. They get frustrated or frightened because maybe they've got a health condition which needs rapid treatment, and they pay for or given incentives to go private, which is what the Tories have been doing for years. It's what Labour have been doing for years. It's what Wesley Streeting's plan is. Fund the private sector to cut through NHS waiting lists. Again, they did this in the last Labour administration. You boost the private sector, you subsidise it, and the private sector comes in and they take all the uncomplicated operations off the NHS waiting list, and they do those and they declare it to be a great success. The complicated stuff gets left on the NHS because the private sector won't want to touch that. That's the plan. Again, like you won't have Wes Streeting going into Parliament saying, I am now presenting the NHS privatisation bill. That's not how this works. They're clever enough to know that if they did that, a gigantic wave of opposition would sweep the country, and it would sweep old Wesley and Keir straight out of office. So they carry on the way that they've been going before, which is, again, bit by bit, bleeding it white, providing a permanent and unending stream of profits to private healthcare. That's the way you do these things. Now, to come to the grisly details itself in just a moment, but to conclude this thought, the working class pushed for hundreds of years to gain access to Parliament, and then as soon as the working class gained access to Parliament, the ruling class found ways to circumvent it and put power elsewhere. This is especially true in imperialist countries. It's true in Britain, it's true in France, true in Germany, true in the United States. And also places like Italy, Belgium, smaller imperialist countries, also very true there. And so the long-standing demand, which is access to the franchise, being able to elect representatives to Parliament, the long-standing demand has been rendered irrelevant by this. And it's been rendered irrelevant by it through that process of bureaucratization. And therefore, a new system has to be worked towards. It's no longer the case that we should demand a people's government, demand this, demand that. Well, you can have a so-called people's government if you want. You could elect a new social democratic party with a massive majority if you want. The only thing it would serve to demonstrate is just how little power actually resides there and just how much institutional power lies elsewhere. So we might as well get on with the business of doing something else, and that something else must be building up a communist party again. But I'll come back to that later. Now on to the grisly details. We are looking at the exit poll here, and you can see this on the front cover of our state propaganda outlet's website. So I'm just going to drop this into the chat if you're not familiar with it. So what is being projected, and bear in mind this is an exit poll, so not all of the details will be clear from this. So they're predicting Labour to get 410 seats, the Tories to get 131, Lib Dems 61. They've recovered to back where they were 20 years ago. Reform, which is a remixed UKIP, Nigel Farage's gang, they're saying they're going to get 13. SNP, Scottish Nationalists, 10, collapsing from their high point of 2015. Others, 25, the others being Plaid Cymru, Welsh Nationalists, 4, Greens, 2, others, 19. The others, most of those come from the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. So the headline figures, though, won't tell us all the stories. But from what I've seen on vote projections, the actual share of the vote that the Labour Party gets to get this 410 number, the actual share of the vote only goes up by about 5%. So on a 5% gain, they get 410 seats. What's happened is the Conservative Party's votes collapsed by 22%. According to, again, these are projections, won't tell us the whole story as yet. And that's the reason for Labour's great majority. And again, it's going to be a majority of around about 80, according to these projections so far. I don't think we've even had the first seat announced yet. So we are waiting for the first seats to come through. I don't think it's going to be quite as much as the exit poll is saying. I think it's going to be slightly less than that. I think the picture is also going to be much more uneven than the bourgeois would like it to be. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So the system we have here, if you're not familiar with it, the beloved first past the post system, tends to over reward winners. So if you win a 5% swing, as Labour look like they're going to, and your opponent's vote just collapses, then of course you get over rewarded by that. And this happened a lot of times. This happened in '83 with the Labour SDP split, where the Tories' vote between 1979 and 1983 actually went down just under a percentage point. But because the Labour vote split in two, they won a much bigger majority. Same for the Tories in 2019, with the Brexit Party taking a big chunk of what had been previously working class Labour voters across the North and the Midlands. That's why the Tories won. Their own vote didn't go up that much, but the Labour vote collapsed and they reaped the benefits of it. Looks like the same thing's going to happen here, but with the Tories paying the price. So this is where we are. And this is obviously a total clusterfuck of the highest order. It is going to be something that isn't going to solve any major problems, i.e. this new government. This new government will solve nothing. Keir Starmer will solve nothing. Because what are the fundamental problems of British imperialism? Fundamental problems go back a very long way. I mean, they go back to the time that Lenin was writing in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But let's take it more short-term than that. A hollowed-out, heavily financialized economy, which is what all late-stage imperialist countries look like, which collapsed in 2008, is underpinned now by gigantic amounts of ongoing state intervention via the Bank of England. State intervention which has been turned on and off at various times through quantitative easing and other measures over the last 16 years. But we've never recovered. The British capitalist economy has never recovered from 2008. nor will it in the next period. The growth rates have been pathetically small, if they've happened at all. And so that's why, of course, the British ruling class was so keen on backing the war against Russia, but they're so keen on backing the aggression against China because they need something to happen. They need the US to cause regime change operations to happen in Russia, at least, China ideally, and the wealth of these countries to be able to be looted by the imperialists. This isn't going to happen, and so the British ruling class doesn't have a lot of options now. If we're going to look to the future for us, in fact for all of Europe, is being written right now in places like Greece, where the Greek government is now pushing through a 6-day working week, the idea being that there's like an almost unlimited amount of hours that what a worker can be asked to do in a week, meaning that the classic response from the capitalist class is going to be attempts at imperialism abroad, and then probably, in fact, almost definitely, attempts at increasing the rate of exploitation of labour at home, meaning that they're going to try and make the British working class work longer hours for the same or less money, and ultimately to have them almost on the same terms as are attempting to be imposed on the Greek working class. That's the future, because that's the only way that British capitalism is going to be made profitable again. Because if they can't expand their imperialist operations, and that's becoming increasingly difficult as the old world order breaks down, then they will try and pass the burden on to the British working class, which brings us and the ruling class into a certain amount of trouble. Because if they try and wage this class war upon the working class in the way that they will need to restore profitability, you're looking at a drastic escalation from where things have been. You see, after the early 1970s, the British ruling class were always clever enough to only go after certain sections of the working class. They tried a full frontal assault in the early 1970s and it didn't work. It led to the defeat of the Heath government. Another one of Jimmy Savile's friends, most likely. So they, under Thatcher, they bacon sliced it, but this was something that was pioneered by the Labour Party. The Labour Party broke up and assaulted the working class in different ways, in that it attempted to break down working class solidarity, break down the united front between the different sections of the union movement that existed in the early 1970s, and then break it down to the point where it could be more easily defeated. So the job that Thatcher has to do is a lot easier when she comes in, because the working class's unity has already been broken. Now, I'm going to have to pause here for just a moment because I've got to go and take care of a barking dog. I'll be back in just a moment. Right, apologies for that. The dog was barking because she'd seen a picture of Keir Starmer on the news and had been disturbed by it. So, to reiterate what I was saying, the the tactics of the ruling class when faced with working class opposition over the last 40 years has been to, again, use a bacon slicer approach. Go after one section at a time, play off the different sections of the working class against each other, and they do this with the full cooperation of the union leaders quite a lot of the time. The reason why the miners' strike of 84 to 85 was lost, well, the principal reason anyway, was because the bulk of the union leaders were collaborating with the government and helping the Thatcher government keep the National Union of Mine Workers isolated and preventing the outbreak of solidarity action. There were a lot of other reasons as well. I can go back over that in a future stream if there's a demand for that. What they've been able to do successfully for many years now is to, again, keep working class struggles isolated and stop the outbreak of a generalized class struggle against them. They're reaching the point now, though, where that tactic isn't going to work as much anymore. They're going to try and increase the rate of exploitation of labor in this country. But they're trying to use the same approach. So they're trying to shove people into working in like special economic zones now. They're trying to, again, use the same methods to restore profitability. But whether that's going to be enough, given the crisis of British imperialism, is something else entirely. I don't think it's going to be enough. I think they're in a much deeper hole. They are facing a situation where they've got nowhere near enough productive industry. They've pinned the development of British capitalism over the last 40 years, arguably longer, to a globalization model that was an American imperialist-led globalization model. With the model that's emerging now, let's call it the multipolar world for want of a better description, that you're not going to be able to exploit a lot of these countries in the same way. See, the way that British imperialism carried on and French imperialism carried on exploiting a lot of countries long after they'd often physically or militarily at least departed from places like Nigeria, for instance, places like Ghana, was that they would, of course, as Kwame Nkrumah describes in his classic work on neocolonialism, make it so that you would set the terms of trade for a lot of these countries that you used to colonize. So yeah, a lot of these countries have natural resources, but they've got to sell them into a global market. And who dominates that global market? Well, it's still all your corporations. And so you can set the terms of trade. You can set disadvantageous terms of trade. You can keep these countries in their place as sources of raw resource extraction and threaten them with sanctions or military intervention if they try and break out of that. Now that's now breaking down. That neo-colonial model is breaking down as well. So you've got an extremely unproductive domestic economy in Britain, heavily financialized. A lot of it for many years was based on consumer spending. Now you have tightening consumer budgets to the point where everything's being bought on credit, or huge amounts of consumer goods are being bought on credit. You have a withered manufacturing sector. You have a lot of the monopoly capitalist companies basing themselves on the ability to inflict unlimited exploitation on many different countries across the world. And as that ability closes down, I'm going to see greater and greater crises domestically. Can Sir Keir Starmer address any of these things? No. They wouldn't be able to address these problems if they had the reincarnation of Disraeli himself in charge. Never mind this dope who spent his entire career as a state asset, got the old tap on the shoulder back in the Oxford days, most likely, like a minor character out of a John le Carré novel, and has spent his entire career as a yes man. An obvious yes man in that he's not very good at thinking on his feet. He's a terrible liar, an obvious liar, and a man who is very clearly, he's a man who's just a follower. He's an order taker. And so the civil servants, the Bank of England, the special advisors will hand him things to say, and he will say them. And that's the nature of Keir Starmer. He's not even as good an actor as the likes of Tony Blair. That's the kind of government we're going to have. You look at that cabinet, and is there anybody in there, that Labour cabinet, that's going to be appointed tomorrow? Is there going to be anybody in there of any real ability? I mean, Streeting, if he gets in, to give him his due, is a better bullshitter. He's a better performer. But most of them, hopeless dopes, because that's all that's required. All that's required of them is that they go out and read lines that are prepared for them. Rachel Reeves isn't making any decisions. Keir Starmer isn't making any decisions. He's given things to say and says them, and the rest of the cabinet goes along with it. And the stuffed dummies that they've got on those benches in Parliament, most of them will go along with it. There might be a couple who have a few ideas of their own, not very many though. Same's true of the Tories, same's true of the Liberals. They're all politicians who have been brought into this model, this hyper-bureaucratized model, whereby they don't ask any questions. Not really. They don't expect to actually do any serious parliamentary work. Most of them will, if they fancy themselves as a big oppositionist, they'll do what Mary Black of the old the SNP, formerly of the SNP, not sure if she's still there these days, or certainly might not be there after tonight, would do, and like give a big speech, put it on like Twitter, and everybody go, "Oh, it's great. She really gave them what for," and that's what passes for opposition now in late stage imperialist countries. You're allowed to go in and bang your fist on the table or wave it in the air and say some things like, "You Tories are increasing the misery of the poor in this country. I'm ashamed to be British, blah, blah, blah." Everybody all the soft leftists put it on YouTube. Everyone shares it on Twitter and goes, "Oh, it's amazing. She really gave them what for." And it's to a half-empty chamber and no one gives a shit. You're allowed to do that. And that's what the more capable of them do. Most of them don't even do that. Because again, like, this isn't a system which lends itself to you making a career in it by being an effective elected representative. If you try and be an effective elected representative, you'll be isolated in your own party, and then you'll be out. You'll be deselected. They'll get rid of you because you're a troublemaker. You're not supposed to rock the boat. Rock the boat. You're supposed to sit there and follow the orders of the party leaders. That's what the system's built to do. You make trouble. Doesn't matter whether it's trouble from, if it's trouble on behalf of the working class, you're definitely out. But even if you're a right winger, like that guy, Tory MP Andrew Bridgen, who's a very right wing guy, but he made the mistake of actually questioning too much the way that COVID was handled. He does it from a kind of a libertarian perspective, but he raised some legitimate questions, and the Tories essentially sandbagged him, withdrew the whip from him, and then tried to get rid of him. Because again, you're going near things you're not supposed to, such as sensitive commercial contracts with pharmaceutical companies, ministerial negligence, that kind of thing. Even if you're doing it from the perspective of a guy who's basically a libertarian, like, they won't tolerate that either. There can be no democratic, even bourgeois democratic dissent anymore. There can be no questioning. They must have absolute uniformity and unanimity around everything they do. And that's the way that the late stage imperialist system is constructed. It is unbending, and therefore it is incredibly brittle. And here we get to a slightly more positive outlook. It's incredibly brittle because its foundations are rotted away. And so the superstructure on this rotten base doesn't want to bend, doesn't want to concede anything, doesn't want to move. All that means is that all the flexibility that the British ruling class used to display in their dealings with the working class is now gone. What you've got there is a petrified bureaucracy, petrified in all senses of the term, which has an incredibly shallow base of support. And this is what the base of support for what in American terms you call the uniparty. The base of support for the uniparty outside of the ruling class is a very thin layer of slightly better off petty bourgeois people who still are doing relatively well in this country. That's the thin layer of support that it has. Some in private business, but the bulk of them, the bulk of the support for what is referred to as the uniparty comes from higher paid public sector managers, NGO people, and related occupations. That's the real base of support for the uni party in this country. It's not even really in the petty bourgeois. The small business, actual small business class, has been rebelling for a while, or trying to rebel in various different ways. But the uni party's support is fundamentally within the bureaucracies itself. So its base of support is very shallow and very brittle. And that it gives it a vulnerability. It's kept in place really by inertia. It's kept in place because there's been no really significant working class struggle that would push it for a long time now, for as long as I've been alive, in fact. The last one being the miners' strike. You could make an argument that there was a big working class rebellion over the poll tax as well. We can discuss that another time. But what will change is that as soon as a major working class struggle emerges, you'll start to see this system wobble in quite a serious way, given that, again, it has no ability to make concessions. Keir Starmer will not be able to solve its problems. And so you will see, once class struggle starts to re-emerge again, in a way that the union leaders cannot shove down ineffective cul-de-sacs, then you'll start to see the system really start to shake, which will be a moment of clarity for millions upon millions of workers who will start to see that the system is not invulnerable. And that will be a great moment, potentially. Our job, I would suggest, as communists, is to build up our own organization and prepare for this moment. But I've spoken for a while now, so I will now take questions and comments. Right. I'm going to go all the way back up to the top. Because there's loads. 704, 703 of you watching. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in so far. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. There's 537 of you on Elon Musk's X and 170 of you on YouTube. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We have Bernardo Bender, who's joining us from the other end of the world. We have Rupert, who says, Keir Starmer refused to prosecute Blair's friend Jimmy Savile. Well, of course he did. Maybe they were all on Jeffrey Epstein's island together. Albert Roundtree is with us, as is Tim Gray. Morgan is with us, as is James Graham. Lucas says, electoral greetings from seat likely to remain under Labour rule. Turnout in my polling station was 45% at 9 p.m. without postal votes. Interesting. We may be on a low turnout tonight. The polling station I went to was very, very empty, very quiet. I wrote, if you want to know what I wrote on my ballot paper, it was vote Stalin, and I just left it at that. Martin joins us from the USA. Yes, well, we share a lousy late stage bourgeois political system with you as well. We're going down together, everybody, our friends in the USA. HM, who's joined us and says, Keir Starmer is officially a war criminal. Well, that's very true. YepX, I have received your emails, and yes, I will rectify that thing about the playlist. Martin says, reading about Nietzsche's accelerationist approach to bourgeois decadence, resonance with your pitiful election. Well, yes, I mean, the bourgeois themselves have become accelerationist unintentionally. Albert's predicting that Sir Keir doesn't get his landslide. Well, I'm hoping you're right, Albert. T.G. Wilson has joined us and says, I'm going to try and pronounce this, Dobre Vice Tovarish. Robson joins us from Jakarta. Hello to Will Johnson. Hello to Potted Rodent. And T.G. Wilson is quoting Yeats to us. And what rough beast! Its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Indeed, indeed. President Jesus is asking if Owen Jones lost. Owen Jones lost the moment that he opened his mouth. And if you know who I'm talking about, you'll understand what I mean. He's a perennial trot wanker man who routinely misrepresents the things he writes about, purports to hold knowledge about things of which he knows nothing, routinely slanders and smears people who don't agree with him, and is generally a hyper-aggressive little shit. Shamefully, I was born in the same hospital as him, but I'm older, so I'm better. according to YouGov poll, Starmer has a whopping 1% support amongst Labour voters, says T.G. Wilson. Yeah, I mean, there is... even if they do get this, like, the majority that the news is saying that they're on track for. So they're low. We got a first result in. Labour have won one seat. So that's a one-seat majority now for Labour. The first seat, which is Sunderland South, has been announced. So even if they get this majority, again, this is a very shallow majority. It is not based on even the level of enthusiasm that I remember being there for Blair in 1997, because that's the first election I properly remember. And again, he's not going to be able to solve any fundamental issues. He doesn't have he's going to act like he's got some, if he gets this result that they are forecasting, he's going to act like he's got some massive mandate when he doesn't. And it's immediately going to piss a lot of people off. And you're going to see very unpredictable results coming out of that. Tim Gray says, what we do know is that the underlying crisis in capitalism is going to be solved by Starmer or the Labour Party. What we have to do is continue to build a real opposition movement. That's correct. Albert says, I was talking to an old trot today. I suddenly realised he's just a social democrat. Absolutely right. Kevin joins us from Sligo, I'm assuming. Zuleika says, jump scare thumbnail, really? Yes, really. I thought, what sums up British bourgeois democracy other than the figure of Jimmy Savile, a paedophile rapist who was close personal friends with several prime ministers? If nothing else, he embodies the system. Sid Hatfield, good evening to you. Jenny, good evening to you. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Brad Wall is with us. Paul McCord is with us, as is Beju. Good evening to you, comrades. Paddy is here. And Ash joins us from the other end of the world. And we have Stephen McKeown, Almere. Sid Hatfield says, 1913 was the time of industrial chaos and massive labour uprisings in the US. No surprise that the Federal Reserve was formed during that period of tumult. Good point. Spurious Furious is here. Jenny says, get all the traitors out. That might take us some time. Sid says, Congress's power was excised in 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act, which established decision-making bodies that had never existed before. Yeah, none of these things are a coincidence. I mean, when you're looking at the establishment of like various different bureaucratic bodies and new systems of government that never existed before, it all happens when the working class steps forward and becomes more powerful. The bourgeois find workarounds. And unless you're going to be honest with the working class about that, then you're leading the working class down a dead end, which is what a lot of the communist parties did after World War II. They didn't analyze this properly. They didn't realize or didn't really properly analyze what was being done with the state structure. They kept saying that, well, one more big heave and get Labour back into office and we'll form a people's government with them. No, the ruling class was taking great care to make sure that their interests were protected, because they would have other ways to thwart any legislative progress that you might make via bureaucratic means. And then if you've elected a so-called people's government, then you have a choice. If the ruling class thwart you via a bureaucratic maneuver, or they try and pressure your people's government by doing a capital flight or something like that, then you have a choice. Do you call out the masses into the streets and to say basically that we are under attack by the forces of the ruling class, and that this so-called democracy that you thought you lived in, it turns out to be a democracy for them, not for you, and we must rebel against this? Or do you crumble and give in, which is what all social democrats do? These are questions we must face now. We must be honest with the working class about the nature of the state. We'll see. We'll have to see how Galloway and the Workers' Party do. I'm not sure how that's going to go at the moment. We will have to see. David Greenwood, good evening to you. Lee Williams, who says, although I couldn't give a shit about these parties, it was quite nice to watch Peter Hitchens stressing about Starmer, calling him a Trotskyite, Gramsci, etc. Yeah, well, it takes one to know one. That's two former members of Trotskyite organizations there. Peter Hitchens is probably more of a right-wing Gramsciist than Keir Starmer is. I mean, I watched Peter Hitchens in interviews about this. He's completely off the ball. I mean, he's completely off the mark about this. Like, Keir Starmer as some sort of, he's a dangerous figure, but not in the way that Peter Hitchens says. Keir Starmer is not a radical. He is an order taker. And he's dangerous because he's taking orders from a ruling class which is in a deep hole and needs to attack the working class relentlessly in order to get out of that hole. That's why he's dangerous. And the other part of the danger of Starmer, as it is with regard to any Labour Party leader, is that they have the allegiance of the trade union leaders as well, who can still exercise their power in terms of trying to crush strikes that threaten the government, and have exercised that power for many decades now. So that's the danger of Starmer. The danger of the Starmer is the same danger that the Labour Party always brings, which is that they come in with the assistance of the trade union leadership, and the trade union leadership defends the Labour government and crushes working class struggle and uses their power to divide and divide again the working class and try and prevent the emergence of a unified class struggle. That's the danger of a Labour government. That's the real danger of Keir Starmer, aided and abetted by the TUC, not whatever obsession Peter Hitchens has got at the moment. Two Sugar says the act that introduced the NHS was repealed in 2012 and it hasn't been the duty of the Health Secretary to provide healthcare to the citizens of the UK for 12 years. No one mentions this. Well, it was mentioned slightly under Corbyn. I mean, they've been removing bits and pieces from the NHS's founding act for years. They've privatized it in all but name. As long as they don't start bringing in like American-style health charges, then they think they can continue to get away with it. However, I think that might be starting to change soon. We don't know, to answer Jenny's question, we don't know what the turnout is just yet. That won't be that won't be clear until tomorrow. They don't even the Galloway's party, the WPB, have been relentlessly shut out of the media coverage because they don't want even like a confused mess of a social democratic party, which is what the WPB are. They don't even want that talked about. They'd much rather everybody talk about Reform and Nigel Farage, which is why Reform has been promoted relentlessly. First of all, they have an element of support in a certain wing of the ruling class, and also in they have a good deal of support in the petty bourgeoisie. They have some working class support as well. I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. But again, Reform get promoted a lot. WPB don't, because even a social democratic operation, they don't want that being promoted, because again, that could lead to dangerous conclusions. Even if somebody's voting for WPB, they might start thinking about things in class terms, and they can't have that. So anything that talks about class has to be either completely kept out of the system, or they will address class only in fake terms. So they'll address, the only person who said working class on the campaign trail that wasn't Galloway was Nigel Farage, because he portrays class in cultural terms. Like, I like a pint and a fag, therefore I'm down with the workers. You're allowed to portray it in the bourgeois press and in the political system that way, or you're allowed to talk about it in terms of whether somebody's posh or whether somebody's not. So you got this over concern amongst British political leaders to not appear too rich. Rishi Sunak was always rather unconvincing at this because he's an incredibly rich man. But like, you have this sort of strange dichotomy of like someone like Blair, for instance, who was desperate to attain riches. That was one of his primary motivations, but also desperate to pretend, just a, ordinary chap. Hello. And so you had that dichotomy. And David Cameron, a guy who couldn't be more traditional ruling class than him, but he was always trying to downplay it. He was always trying to sort of look more ordinary. And again, this is the product of like the 1960s and the Thatcher era, where you get the sort of the discrediting of the old aristocratic political caste in this country. But and also you get the sort of the illusions of Thatcherism, which is the idea that, oh, anybody can make it in this country. You're not bound because the aristocrats aren't obviously in charge anymore. Therefore, anybody can make it to the top. Of course, that's not true. And so even someone like David Cameron would always try and play down his origins and just make it look as if he was just a bloke who liked a pint in a pub, just like Nigel Farage. Again, this is how class is allowed to be represented. So you get like ridiculously right-wing, very reactionary Labour MPs like John Prescott, now Lord Prescott, who was once a working class militant, very much not anymore, still playing on his working class credentials when he's manifestly an enemy of the working class. A lot of Labour MPs do this. The comedian Mark Thomas used to call it acting prolier than thou. A lot of them still do it. And that's the only way, again, this is the ways that class is allowed to be discussed. You're allowed to falsely claim humble origins. You're allowed to talk about class in terms of what food you like to eat or how many pints you can drink. But in terms of actual class relations, relations of production, who actually owns the economic base of the country, why economic relations are as they are, proper discussion of class relations, none of that's allowed. That has to be completely shut out of the system, because the people that really make the decisions, they know very well where that conversation goes, and it's not somewhere that's favourable to them. Ash says, so this looks like a Labour landslide in inverted commas, but the bourgeois want, but the vote share is down. Yeah, if it turns out that way, I'm thinking we might end up, but we might end up with something more complicated than that. But yeah, it's a weak landslide, basically, a very shallow one. Hello to Jawad, and good evening to you, comrade. And you say, we being the first dead imperialist country, do we owe ourselves a revolution? How many more years? Well, it's been almost 400 years since the last one. I think we're overdue for one, comrade, to be honest. Matt Vairunov says Britain should adopt ranked choice voting. I don't think that would do any good because, yes, you may end up with like more, the WPB MPs, more Green MPs. Not the Greens aren't oppositional at all, but you're gonna have the same problem, which is that it's not the composition of Parliament as such. It's the fact that power doesn't lie there; it lies elsewhere. And also, you're going to end up with a problem that the economic base has rotted away. So no matter what, voting system you have, how are you going to address that? How are you going to address the fact that even if you got your, people's government in there, as I said before, when as soon as you get in, your options are foreclosed upon, or they attempt to foreclose your options bureaucratically, when they trigger an economic collapse, just as they threatened to do, even with Liz Truss. And you end up in a situation where you either capitulate or call upon the masses to mobilize and roll the dice. Again, like most of the people who are involved, even in left oppositional work now, they're not thinking in those ways. Because, again, like we've reached the point now where the system cannot make concessions to us. It's too deep in the hole. And so therefore, the way in which things are laid out is that let's go back and use the Corbyn example. Let's say that Jeremy Corbyn had won that election that he almost did in 2017. Okay. Let's assume that he got a workable majority. Let's assume for a moment that he gets the same majority that Keir Starmer is on course to apparently get, which is like around about an 80-odd seat majority. Okay? So, what happens? Well, what happens is immediately the ruling class would declare essentially all-out war on you. And they would declare all-out war in various different ways. The first way would be, of course, causing a panic in the market. Not hard to do. Again, we saw their moves. They made their moves clear to us with Liz Truss. The Bank of England governor would start an immediate panic in the markets. Various things would start tanking, such as pension funds. You really want to cause a panic, you start tanking pension funds. A lot of people's retirements pegged to investments in the stock markets. So you start tanking those, you're going to cause a lot of instability very quickly. You start running panicked stories in the press. Is the Prime Minister fit for the job? Capital flight out of the country. Investments under threat. Government must change course. Has Corbyn lost the plot? His own MPs are briefing against him. The cabinet is split. There are rumours of revolt amongst the military. We had all this already, by the way. All of this stuff happened before he got anywhere near power. The government must act to restore confidence. The markets must be reassured. If we do not reassure the markets, millions of people's pensions are at risk. You can see the way this goes. And it didn't take, and again, I can work off the Liz Truss example. It didn't take too long to panic the moronic Conservative MPs into getting rid of her. And it wouldn't have taken too long to panic enough opportunistic and idiotic or just straight up reactionary Labour MPs to make an immediate move on Corbyn. Confidence in the market must be restored. We must restore order to the economy. The economy must not be threatened. Corbyn's plans were uncosted. They were unrealistic. They have caused a panic in the markets. Our international partners are having doubts about us. We must act as responsible members of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank and World Trade Organization. What will our trade partners think of us if we cannot properly manage our finances? After all, the government cannot spend more than it takes in. We must balance our finances and act responsibly if we are to be taken seriously as a government. You see the way that it would go. And once all of that has been done to you, once you've had a million scare stories written about you in the bourgeois press, once the conventional media is blaring stories about you out 24/7, round the clock, with paid troll farms of British intelligence operatives or agency workers that they hired for the job, belting out tweets 24/7 about how it's all falling apart, the country's on the brink of the abyss, you must do something, the Prime Minister must resign. He must hand over to a more moderate figure. Perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister, a certain Mr. Tom Watson. You see, once that ball starts rolling, then you only really have one option. Well, you have two, in actual fact. One, which is the option I believe Corbyn would have chosen if he had been in that situation, which is complete and total capitulation, because that's what he did every time he was challenged. And it wasn't just about him and his poor politics and his lack of character. It was a structural thing. Where's the support for a social democratic Labour leader supposed to come from? The trade union leaders? Don't count on them. They'd run for cover as soon as the shit hit the fan. Len McCluskey, very unreliable. Former General Secretary of Unite, meant to be one of Corbyn's big allies. He would have been very unreliable if the situation got turbulent. So where's the support going to come from? Your only chance, if you're leading some sort of people's government, some sort of reforming government, not just in Britain, but in any capitalist country, is if you up the ante. You either have to resign, capitulate, and hope that they don't throw you in prison or kill you, or you have to then roll the dice, and you have to roll the dice on a popular mobilization. Big thing to do. Suddenly, you, the elected leader of the country, is going to have to go out there and explain to the mass ranks of the working class what's really going on. To get a popular mobilization that stands a chance of actually working, you would have to go out and you would have to address millions of people. You have to speak over the heads of your rotten and traitorous MPs, over the heads of this disgusting collection of mutants in Parliament, over the heads of the House of Lords and the monarchy. You would have to go and speak to the great masses of the British working class, lower and deeper into the masses, as Lenin once said, and tell them the truth about the British bourgeois system. Tell them the truth about how Parliament works or does not work, or could never work for them. Tell them the truth about what the monarchy's there for. Tell them the truth about the Labour Party. Tell them the truth about the trade union leaders. Because to mobilise them, you'd have to tell them the truth. You'd have to tell them the truth about what is really blocking you as a popular reforming government, assuming that we're talking about Corbyn here. You'd have to basically dismantle the Labour Party itself in front of the eyes of the working class, because you'd have to tell them the truth about why the Labour Party is not there to do reforms for you. Not really. And it hasn't been for ever. So you would have to then, of course, confront the power of the trade union leaders. You'd have to encourage a revolt of the base of the trade unions against their own leadership, to force the leadership to actually back up the government that millions of workers had voted for. And suddenly you're in a situation where it's no longer about this reform or that reform. You're suddenly in a situation where you're challenging the whole system. And the system is not going to like that. And the people who are at the top of this are going to fight back, not just the monopoly capitalists, but their servants in the military and in the intelligence services and in the press and everywhere else that's an enemy center of power. And suddenly you've got to address them for what they are, which is enemy centers of power. So you're seeing how quickly this escalates. And so why somebody like Corbyn, who spent his entire career as a comfortable backbencher, would not want anything to do with that. Of course he wouldn't. Who'd want something to do with that? Because suddenly you are leading a revolt directly against the oldest and most established and most vicious and most reactionary and most blood-soaked ruling class in the world. You think they'd hesitate to break out the guns if they really thought they were under threat? Of course they wouldn't. And again, like, this is why, fundamentally, the Corbyn movement failed. Because to make it succeed, you would have to do start to do all the things that I just said. Nobody in the Labour Party wants that kind of action. None of them. Certainly not in 2017. Nobody was ready for that. Wasn't on the cards. There are people out there amongst the great masses of the working class who would be perhaps in the mood for some kind of revolt. But again, if you're going to lead some kind of revolt, then you need to prepare. You need to actually prepare the masses for what they might face. And nobody was doing that, or very few people were doing that. And here I'll call upon a quote from a great British communist of the past, a certain Sylvia Pankhurst, who said upon the formation of the Communist Party of Great Britain all the way back in, over 100 years ago now, she said the following: "Let us face the facts, comrades. The education of the masses is a large and strenuous task. But there can be no communism until the masses desire communism and act communism. We cannot take part in the work of education till we ourselves deeply imbued with the communist ideal, and unless our thoughts and our desires are constantly turning towards it." And unless you are, as Sylvia Pankhurst described, imbued with the communist ideal and turning your thoughts constantly towards it, and unless you're able to imbue the masses with that ideal, you shouldn't be in the business of starting revolts. Because now we're in a position where the revolt is all or nothing. We're not in 1945 anymore. There's no scope for reform. The revolt now would be all or nothing. And again, nobody's prepared for that. Nobody's prepared for that in 2017. More people are more in a mood to revolt now. But again, that consciousness of what that would mean is not there. Not amongst enough people. I think enough working class people will get their heads around it quite quickly. Many workers know instinctively that they're being stiffed, know that the system doesn't work for them, know that the bureaucracies are their enemies. But to put it all together and to understand it properly, well, that takes the advance of a communist party. And we're going to come back to that later. Let's just say it, says Sid, we cannot hope to legislate for the working class through these bourgeois systems of governance. No. Sid is 100% correct. Grassy Knoll, good evening to you. Rista Kostadinov, apologies if I've mangled your name there. For Greece, it already was a reality, even 7 days work a week. If you work in the tourist sector for tourism, you need to provide convenience to tourists. Very good point. Rupert says, in a rational socialist system, work hours would be distributed evenly as a form of community service. Interesting reflection there. Yet X says, in my opinion, people should only have to work 3 days a week and make more than enough income from doing so. This would allow the proletariat to have a life and not work themselves to exhaustion. Well, this is something which has been said on numerous occasions. I mean, you go back all the way to Engels talking about the potential for life under socialism to be working for a few hours a day and then engaging in literary criticism in the evening. This has always been a dream. To make usage of advanced systems of production to cut the work hours right down so you can produce everything that needs to be produced inside 2 to 3 days a week, and then the great bulk of the working class can turn their minds towards, well, not just leisure but towards the act of governing the country. And that's something that I think we should emphasize more. Ash says, apparently Corbyn's seat is too close to call. Yeah, that ain't going to get called until tomorrow, I don't think. Labour with 2 seats now, apparently. So we will be announcing as we go onwards. Martin Maloyevich is enjoying the Savile Blair picture. There's plenty of Savile pictures with various different prime ministers. If you really want a good laugh, just Google Jimmy Savile, Prince Charles, now King Charles. Loads of pictures of them together. Yes, the dog was performing a tribute to the Duran, and the dog is a golden retriever, by the way. If you were looking for the breed there. Hello to Abtin, who has joined us, and Paddy says proportional representation might seem better on paper, but can tell you we have it in Ireland, and the same bunch of useless ruling class nitwits still get in every single time. Yeah, it doesn't improve your options, like. Proportional representation, electoral reform, constitutional reform, all these things like liberals and leftists used to get very excited about. Doesn't mean anything. Like, it doesn't improve your options. Again, like, wouldn't change like what you would be faced with if you actually got into government as a reforming, let's just assume a reforming leftist government that was containing some sincere people, got in and tried to do something. You'd still be faced with all the same problems. Doesn't matter if it was elected by a first past the post or elected via proportional representation. It doesn't change any of the objective conditions that you face. Dogs are good judges of human character, says Grassy Knoll. Very true. Mine always barks at Keir Starmer. Abtin says, in Iran, what it took was the army firing at crowds with machine guns. Well, yes. The people believe, to respond to Abtin's point, there is a deep bias amongst the upper working class and the petty bourgeois in this country that couldn't happen here. It could. They've done it before. Yeah, a while ago, but they were prepared to consider a military coup not too long ago. And what do you think they do to people who oppose a military coup? Arrest, in some cases, worse in others. Like there is a strong bias amongst certain segments of the population in this country to believe, as I said, that certain things just can't happen here. Well, they can. It can degenerate very quickly. If the ruling class feels that they're under threat, they will start to do things which people think can only happen overseas. Again, this goes back to the deep delusions that many of us grow up with in Britain, which is that because it's not been invaded successfully since 1688, and that was more of a coup than an invasion, so really it hasn't been invaded successfully since 1066. There's been a lot of wars and civil wars and death and misery in the meantime. But because there's been this long period of relative stability, a lot of people develop delusions about what is and what isn't possible. Kevin, my point of showing a picture of Jimmy Savile with all these people is that Jimmy Savile was a horrific sex offender, and they all knew it, and they all wanted a picture taken with him. So what the fuck does that tell you about the kind of people who rule over us? Think on that. Sid Hatfield says, the highly paid, well-to-do class here in the US is made up of people who sit behind a desk, produce nothing, and traffic in debt services. Well, that's certainly true. Dan Kovalik is with us. Good to have you with us, Dan. Be good to have you on the program soon. Drop me a line about that if you can. Keir Starmer could be replaced by an android, says Rupert. The android would have more personality. This is what a man with a dead soul looks like. Grassy Knoll says 1 out of 7 US employees work for a private equity firm. Do they? My God. I mean, I'm not doubting that. Something I clearly need to look into. Well, who's we, Kevin? This Kevin Grant chap saying, we won, you lost, get over it. Who's we? Exactly. Can you clarify who the we is? Jenny says, with puppets like Biden, even the normies are starting to realize who's really in charge. Yes, and that's why Biden should definitely run for a second term, and he should definitely win. He's providing us with a magnificent demonstration as to the validity of Lenin's analysis of imperialism. Grassy Knoll says the hedge fund donors are pulling their support for Joe Biden, blaming Jill Biden for not telling Joe to drop out of the running after the so-called clown show debate. Well, you got to think, like, these hedge fund guys aren't stupid. I mean, they can turn on a television. They can see what state Biden's in. Like, I know they're busy scamming the whole world, but, like, what did they think was going to happen? Just proves that, by the way, these guys aren't all that smart. They're not as clever as they think they are, or as clever as they'd like you to think they are. Like, some of these guys actually thought that they could get away with running Biden again. Really wasn't going to work out for them. Because what? Because he gave a halfway convincing State of the Union speech for, what, a few minutes? And suddenly they had to put him on there for an hour against Trump, and he looked like he was dead. Very funny video of Trump, by the way, going, yeah, we beat the crap out of him. He's going to drop out. It's going to be Kamala. She's going to be terrible, folks. Terrible. Trump versus Kamala, I'm going to enjoy him enormously. But for the purposes of political education, I hope old Joe stays in. Stay in, Joe. Hunter, if you're watching, tell your old man he's got to stay in. Otherwise, you know what's going to happen to you. Turnout in Sunderland is down to 51%. That is way down. If it's like that all over the country, we're looking at the lowest turnout. Could end. I mean, that's Sunderland. The seat in Sunderland is a particularly poor area. So I think what we're going to see is the poorer the area is, the lower the turnout's going to be. That's my educated guess. Say the more petty bourgeois areas will probably have a higher voter turnout because there's more delusions there. The people of Sunderland South, or nearly half of them, have made the correct decision that nothing in that process speaks to them at all. And those people are right. And it's those people we need to be, as communists, need to be relating to. Yes, T.G. Wilson, that is my quote. I will be putting it on a T-shirt. If you try to act like an elected representative, you will be removed. Right. So you're from Reform UK, Kevin. Well, welcome along. You won't be kicked out unless you act like a twat. Well, let's see. I mean, did you think that this was a Labour Party channel? Because it really isn't. I mean, if you do get 13 seats, I'm not surprised. Your man's been promoted by the bourgeois press for 20 years. Trumpton riots, yes, maybe we'll play that as our exit music. We have Robert in Detroit joining with us. We have 821 people watching. Again, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Sammy Gitt says, a win for Starmer's Labour is an endorsement of genocide by the majority of the country. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, Starmer's Labour shouldn't have got a single vote, but none of this is a vote for Starmer. The actual vote for Starmer is tiny. Nobody likes the fucker. Barely anybody. His own wife doesn't fucking like him. So this is a vote that is going to be principally against the Tories. If we end up with half the electorate not voting, it's not a vote that symbolises anything other than the fact that there's a knee-jerk response after 100 years of this being the pattern, Labour, Tory, Labour, Tory. The knee-jerk response is when the Tories have got too disgraceful that it bounces back to Labour. But again, this will be the shallowest, weakest majority that they've ever got. Even if it looks big, even if Starmer goes on TV tomorrow and goes, we have been given a sacred mandate by the British people to deliver hope and change. No, he's not got jack shit. Because, again, like, huge amounts of the electorate won't have voted for him. Let's assume that the turnout is above the Sunderland figure. Let's assume the turnout is around about 55 to 60%. That's 40%, 40-odd% of people not turning out at all. That's a very, very shallow majority, a very brittle government over a system that can't be reformed. It's not going to be an easy ride for him at all. How do you get anyone motivated to vote without saying Hitler is on the ballot? Says President Jesus. Well, they tried that. I mean, they've tried putting Farage in the Hitler role, but Nigel Farage is just an old-fashioned Tory, so no one's convinced by that. And given that the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition are enthusiastically endorsing a genocide in Gaza, like it's rather hard to put Farage in the Hitler role when the Hitler candidates are the two main parties principally. And by the way, like if we're talking about blood-soaked imperialism, the Labour Party is every bit as blood-soaked as the Tories are, and as Farage hasn't been in power yet, like he's got nothing on either of them, really. The Labour Party did the Iraq War, and look at what that did. Tories did the Libyan War and the Syrian War, as did the Liberals, by the way. So they're all up to their necks in this, and they're going to claim that like somebody else is the fascist. Like Hope Not Hate, for instance, this fucking ridiculous government-run so-called anti-fascist organization, was spending seemingly most of the time campaigning against Galloway. Why? Because he spreads division. Again, just revealing exactly what this is. Like the Hope Not Hate used to get donated to by the trade union movement. I really hope nobody, if that comes up for renewal at anybody's branch meeting or trades council meeting, you should be fucking blocking it. Because they spent the election campaign shilling for the ultra-reactionary Labour Party, who've done far more to promote racism in this country than anybody other than the Conservative Party. Labour and the Tories do far more to promote racism and division in the working class of this country than any overt fascist party has ever done. And that's because, of course, they represent an imperialist system, and the imperialist system routinely engaged in mass slaughter of people overseas and the reinforcement of racialism inside the country to keep the working class divided. Thanks for the compliment, Sid. Be sure to like and share everything if you can. Huge landslide win, says The Guardian. That's quoted by Todd. Yeah, well, The Guardian would fucking say that. It's an outlet for MI5. Carolus Maximus, says, I voted Workers' Party as an impotent protest vote for all the dead babies they made me look at. Yeah, well, good point on that. Is HHHEEE says, is this the best the system can offer? Time to throw it away. You are correct. Songs 4K says, not all late bourgeois states fall at the same time. The UK and EU are falling faster, the US slower relative to others like China and Russia. Yeah, the US has got more juice in the system than we have. Like if the EU and Britain are going to go down relatively soon. I mean, British ruling class still have got a lot of capital at their disposal floating around in the city of London and elsewhere. They might make a little bit of a stab at lasting longer, but we're in the end game now. It just depends whether it's quicker or faster. I would rather that we brought it down ourselves rather than leave it to the ruling class to decide what kind of hellhole we get plunged into as they try and save themselves. Rupert says, Owen Jones is awful on Yugoslavia. He was born in 1984. He was around 7 at the time. He's awful on everything. Like every single major issue, he takes the imperialist side, or he takes like the side of reactionary libertinism, shall we say. He's an horrible piece of crap, to give you my authentic Northwestern response. He's a reactionary, always has been. Like anti-communist, social chauvinist, pro-imperialist scumbag. Songs 4K says, the polling showed the only reason people vote Labour is that they're not the Tories. Exit poll shows Reform eating into both. Yeah, not a surprise at all. Reform have been heavily promoted. They've got a decent budget. They tap into work done by the Brexit Party and UKIP, so why wouldn't they get a big vote? Bear in mind, UKIP got 4.5 million, I think, votes 9 years ago. And that's before Brexit, before the collapse of the Conservative Party. So they've got a base to build on, and they've got probably the most single recognisable and arguably successful political figure of the last 20 years at their head, which is Farage, the guy who can claim with some legitimacy to have forced the Brexit vote. So, again, their result is not a surprise if you've been paying attention. Good evening to you, Songs 4K. Good evening to Freak Unique, who says, good evening from Tory Fiona Bruce's Congleton, UK. Pretty close to me, actually. Rupert says, Gramsci's works were first translated into English by Pete Buttigieg's father, which, again, I've looked at those translations. They're awful. All right, apparently Gordon says Galloway is lost up in Rochdale. Do we have confirmation of that yet? I haven't seen anything come through, but it wouldn't surprise me, in all honesty. I mean, Galloway won that seat on a low turnout protest vote. He's not held any of the seats that he's ever won. He's won 2 seats before in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005. I think it was Bradford West, was it, in 2012. He lost both of them in the subsequent election. So again, he didn't have a lot of time to build up an organization in Rochdale. So if he loses, I'm not surprised. Reform UK had a much bigger budget and much better media coverage than Galloway did. It was always going to be an uphill struggle. There are going to be a lot of people disappointed with that, but that is how things stand. HM says, apparently Galloway will lose his seat. It was helpful that Andrew Tate's brother donated to him out of nowhere. Yes, well, the Tate brothers are, shall we say, I would say they're being promoted by certain forces. And Andrew Tate's brother suddenly decides to donate to Galloway. I mean, yeah, it's plausible given the whole anti-woke stance that Galloway's taken. But again, a little bit dubious. US-style scam care is coming to an NHS near you. That's their plan in the end. How soon we get there is another question. Peter Hitchens thinks Rachel Reeves will adopt North Korean Mao economics. If Rachel Reeves was as interesting as that, I would be campaigning for her. If Rachel Reeves was actually somebody who was like putting forward British Juche and was actually a secret Maoist, that would be somebody I would be interested in voting for. But she's not. She's a bland Bank of England trained technocrat who's just going to do what she's told. Good evening to Heidi, who's joined us. Just scrolling through the comments here. Blythe declared, Labour 20k, Reform 10.8, Conservatives 6.1, Greens 1.9, Liberal 1.4. Yeah, the Reform are going to probably be, there's going to be a lot of horse trading, but Reform, if they do as well as it looks like they're going to do, if they did push the Conservatives into third place, which I doubt they will, but ultimately the Conservatives will have to renew themselves. The Conservatives will hang on to a lot of their core seats, but Reform will get a decent amount of votes. So ultimately, I think that Reform and the Tories will ultimately merge, just the way that the existing right-wing parties in Europe will all end up being absorbed by or merging with the likes of Le Pen and Meloni and AfD in Germany. Those who will be denounced as fascists today by the ruling class will end up being called respectable stateswomen and men tomorrow, and then being put into government once they've merged with the remains of the existing bourgeois right-wingers. No reaction from the markets, and Labour will be delighted, apparently, says the BBC. Freak Unique says, I can only imagine that if Corbyn challenged the whole system, or anyone for that matter, they'd be JFK'd. Or I ended, I think is the other way to look at it. Ash says, in Australia, we had a Conservative bloodbath in 2023, but got a weak Labour government with lots of independents due to preferences. We have 3-year terms, so they could face a hit next year. Gaza is a flashpoint. Interesting. Niall Fraser joins us from Hong Kong. Good to have you with us. The world is absurd, says Zargo5. Spike Milligan looks sane nowadays. Interesting point. Does spoiling your ballot count towards turnout? It does, but they've got to record it as a spoilt ballot to answer that. Well, you can't really fix anything by being the MP of a certain area, to answer Absint's point. Like, there's to fix Rochdale, I mean, my God, I've been there. It takes a lot of fixing. You'd need to have control of the council, and then you'd need to have probably control over the Greater Manchester mayoralty, because it's under Greater Manchester, and then you'd need to be able to address the budget question. That's several levels which Galloway, even if he was a very efficient constituency MP, wouldn't be able to control. So, it was always, I think it's likely to be the case that the seat defaults back to Labour, but we'll have to see. Because Labour, by the way, completely shot themselves in the foot during the by-election there when Galloway won by selecting a candidate, then deselecting him. They imported some horrible media twat from London called Paul Waugh to run this time, I think. So they would have put some serious resources and effort into getting rid of Galloway. We'll see how that works. James Graham says the Communist Party of Britain support Hope Not Hate. The Communist Party of Britain are a disgrace, and nobody who is a communist should be a member of theirs. Absolutely ridiculous collection of absolutely ridiculous organization. Owen Jones is the next generation of Paul Mason. That's true. Zuleika agrees with my judgment that Farage is just an old-fashioned Tory. Anthony asks, think Chris Williamson might win his constituency? No, I don't. If I'm proven wrong, I will hold my hands up on that one, but I can't see it. Look, turnout's down. A higher turnout, I think, would probably favour independents more, because it would mean that to actually win as an independent, and you would need to do an awful lot of preparation work. And this is part of the reason why they called it early. I mean, Sunak didn't need to go until December, arguably perhaps January of next year. But he went now, some say over economic matters, because it was only going to get worse. But the other argument was that it was purely a political decision. And it was a political decision to try and cut off the development of independent challenges to Labour and the Conservatives, particularly Galloway's crew. But to win in a seat like Chris Williamson's, which I believe he's trying to stand in his old seat in Derby, you'd need to be out there holding, like knocking on doors, making people aware of who the party is, making people aware of who the candidate is. So I think he's fairly well known in the area, but not as universally known as you'd need to be. You'd need months organising community meetings, getting people out, to surveying them, learning what their issues are, responding to their issues, basically running like a full-blown political campaign for months on end in a target constituency before you got in to win it. This is why protest votes blow up in by-elections, because suddenly the entire national media focuses in on a by-election, meaning that a candidate like Galloway starts to pick up some serious coverage. And of course, by-elections do generate a lot of protest votes as a result of that, partly as a result of that. To win in a general election, you need to fight against the trend to, first of all, punish the Conservatives. And the most natural way people can think of to punish the Conservatives is voting Labour, or sometimes voting for Farage's crew. But what you need to do to overcome that is essentially motivate thousands of people who wouldn't ordinarily vote to, first of all, register to vote if they're not registered, and turn out to vote on the day. So that was what you would need to do. And that, again, takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of volunteers to give up their time to do it. And you can get that. But again, they didn't have enough time to do that this time round. Now, maybe, being fair here, a lot of these campaigns that the WPB have run, that are run with serious candidates who are somewhat rooted in their local area, can continue, and will try and build a long-lasting organization. So when we do get another election, which we may do at some point sooner than Starmer would like, you're in a better place to run. But again, it takes a lot of work to overturn 100 years of habit. And Galloway does not have a good track record at building lasting parties. I mean, I remember Respect, it was literally up like a rocket and down like a stick. AJ Williamson says, the only good thing about this election is the collapse of the SNP. That will be rather funny. Zuleika makes a correct assessment saying Reform has had excessive media coverage. Yeah, they have. I mean, they put Farage in those debates. Okay, what are you basing him being there on? Opinion polls or parliamentary presence? Because prior to tomorrow, Reform had no parliamentary presence. Galloway was a sitting MP. He wasn't included in those debates, and Farage was. So that's a clear-cut case of somebody being promoted. Yeah? You can't just say, well, it's based on opinion polls. Well, okay, well, if it's based on opinion polls, then, why on earth is it that you put Sunak in the big two? Because on certain opinion polls, Reform were close to or beating the Conservatives. So if we're going to go off opinion polls, then surely it should have been Sunak, Starmer versus Farage. So it's clearly not just off opinion polls. It's based on a result that those running the media operations wants to see, and they don't want Galloway there. And they don't want Galloway there because, for all his flaws, and I've enumerated those before, he will put his finger in their faces and say, you're supporting a genocide, like you've betrayed the working class, you're a pile of shit, and he'll do it in a way that does appeal to people. Like Galloway's style it alienates some, but it appeals to many other working class people. And that's why they didn't put him in there. They want the working class protest vote to go to Farage, really. They don't want Farage to win, and he won't, but they want that working class protest vote going to the right. They don't want it going even to a Social Democratic Party. British Duce is the only hope. Well, let's hope that Peter Hitchens is right and that Rachel Reeves is actually the woman who's writing the British Duce as we speak. She's a long-term deep cover agent inside the Labour Party. When she gets into office as Chancellor, she will coup out Keir Starmer, appeal to the masses, and institute British Duce, and she will immediately imprison the Governor of the Bank of England. If only any of that was true. CJ Jackson says third way socialism is the bane of our society. I would go further than that. I'd say social democracy is the bane of our society, because what it did was, in return for a period of reform, it basically gave generation after generation of people a false view of what the capitalist state can and will deliver to you. Matthew says, in relation to Biden, I think they'll run him. His support will still vote for the party and against Trump. They would vote for a cigarette butt as long as it's Democrat. That's true to an extent, but I think he's going to lose. I mean, whoever runs for the Democrats, I think, is on a hiding to nothing. So you can see why, on some level, they might just decide to, well, let old Joe take the fall for it, and we'll just rebuild the party afterwards. Luca, yes, you're right. The only ones worth cheering for are the ones for the numbers for the live stream. 701 of you on X, 176 of you on YouTube. Like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Do you think Starmer is going to last the term if they win? To quote Harold Macmillan, to use Zuleika, events. If there's going to be like serious disturbances, serious industrial struggle, and serious economic problems, then he might not last the pace. I mean, he doesn't look particularly convincing. He looks panicked. Like they're gonna try and build him up as a great statesman now, but like he's gonna look less convincing than Biden pretty soon. They may try and stick the horrific homunculus Wesley Streeting in there if things go really wrong. But again, it all depends upon the nature of the struggle. If the class struggle increases to levels that we've not seen for many, many years, then the trade union leaders' hold gets disrupted over the unions, and we start to see positive things like that, then the ruling class will demand a new coalition. They'll demand a more stable government, because even some of the Labour MPs will start to wobble if that happens. Will the so-called socialist, so-called campaign, so-called group be safe? Starmer has an 80-seat majority. They're all loyal Starmeroids, i.e. people with no brain, and will just do what they're told. Yeah, they'll be safe for now, because they're never going to challenge him. Not really. I mean, if he goes after them and purges them after victory, that's a bit of a dumb move, because they're not going to do anything to seriously challenge him. Like, all he had to do was to crack the whip once over that stop the war letter regarding Ukraine, and they all just fell into line. I mean, I would prefer it if he left them where they were and they sank with him, to be honest. I mean, if he purges them in a weird way, he's doing them a favour. It makes them look much more dangerous than they actually are. Zarg says, energy cap due to rise again in the winter. Bad luck for the Tories if they called the election in that period. That's a fair point. Songs 4K says, free declarations all Labour hold so far. Okay. Dems are toast this year, says Anthony. You're probably right. CJ Jackson says, do you reckon Labour will spend their way to growth like the US has done? The growth in the US is all fake. Like fueled by, again, like fueled, they've managed to do a bit of a boom via government spending, but again, it's not sustainable. We will see how things work out here. I mean, Starmer's saying he's not going to basically borrow to spend. Now, he will end up doing it. Again, I can't see them doing that in the same way. Like Biden's big spending bill was basically a giant corporate handout. They're proposing some of that, like Great British Energy is a giant corporate handout. That's all it is. He's been going around going, we're going to have Great British Energy. It's going to reduce prices. What it is essentially a government body that's going to be in charge of distributing funds and grants and subsidies to green energy providers. Yeah. So it's going to be basically a corporate handout. Just the same way Biden's various different bills, like his infrastructure bill, were just huge corporate handouts. That's all it was. Could Gaza be the first issue the Labour government stumbles upon? Depends how it shakes out, Luca, to answer your question. The US imperialists are still caught in a dilemma. They would like this to calm down because they can't. I mean, the Israeli economy is tanking. Israel's becoming more and more unstable. They're losing the war. Some of them want to fight a war on the northern border against Hezbollah, a war they cannot win. So, the US would love to calm it all down, get rid of Netanyahu and the overt fascists, and bring in a liberal face that I've said many times before. They don't seem to be able to do that, though. Netanyahu is the stabilizing factor in Israeli politics. He's the only one who can pull together reliable coalitions. Horrendous character though he is. So if he goes, then what little stability Israeli politics has goes with it, and the US is desperate for that not to happen. And Netanyahu knows that, so they're stuck with him. And so he will continue the war for as long as he thinks he can get away with it. And he knows the US won't cut him off, unless, of course, things in the US get to the point where you've got a much bigger, more disturbing domestic revolt that would lead them to have to change course, or they're under pressure elsewhere in the world and they can't afford to keep supporting Israel. But the reason why they keep supporting Israel is that without Israel, their position in the Middle East gets seriously compromised. So again, this is a situation of imperialism being damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. The saving grace for Starmer is that he can sort of hide behind the US position, which he's been doing already. But the pressure should be kept up on him, most definitely. And his pressure should be increased in the unions with regard to motions about Gaza and, of course, non-cooperation with the war machine. Those are all important things to do. Just Stop Oil are sickening foundation-sponsored agitators campaigning for corporate tax relief, says Songs 4K. Yeah, that's true. So, thank you to all 875 of you tuning in right now. We are looking at Labour gaining Swindon South from the Conservatives. Well, I've been to Swindon. You know what? They're welcome to it. Yeah, they're gone up one so far. What gained one seat from the Conservatives? So we'll see how this shakes out. Okay, so bringing this to a conclusion, what I'm going to say is that to reiterate the points I've been making across the stream so far, we are in a situation where nobody who wins tonight in this bourgeois farce is going to be able to get the British working class out of the hole the British ruling class have dug for us. That will be something which nobody in this system can deliver. And so the task for us is to prepare for the next phase of the struggle, because the ruling class is going to come after the working class in a serious way, and resistance will automatically follow. So what is the task for those of us who are communists at this stage? And those of us who are communists must engage ourselves in the serious business of rebuilding a communist party across every working class area of the country. That is what we must do now. This is no easy task, and it is not something that we can go into promising the working class that we will have answers for them tomorrow. It is a recognition of the fact that the long-term struggle is to build ourselves a viable vanguard party. That is the struggle now. There will be all kinds of social democratic deviations that pop up over the next few months and years as the system plunges further and further into crisis. But the only thing that is going to actually provide a genuinely better future for the overwhelming majority of the working class, and indeed most of the middle class in Britain now, will be a communist party that can train enough people to respond properly to the crises when they arise, and to be in with a chance of, at some point in the future, removing the British ruling class from power and instituting socialism that way. And that is why it is down to us to rebuild a nationwide, genuinely nationwide communist party now. Now, at this point, I will say that I believe and am confident that the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, are the only serious communist party in the country. We are small, but trying to build ourselves everywhere at the moment. And we are interested in building, of course, all the way across the country, in every working class community that we possibly can. And we aim to train as many cadre communists as we possibly can to be able to be within the working class, both learning from and hopefully leading the working class in the future. And that is our future, building a communist party that can actually act as a militant organization of the class. That is our task now. The social democratic distractions are all useless. They will lead you absolutely nowhere. It's very tempting to think that if we can just get a few MPs into Parliament, if we can just push for some reforms, that things can be improved. We all grow up with those prejudices. They're all ingrained in us by that period of social democratic reform that happened immediately after World War II. That period's over now. There will be no reform. There will only be relentless downward pressure on working class people's living standards. There will only be relentless class war waged upon us by the ruling class, to which we have to respond by organizing our own party, which should be and must be a communist party, and putting ourselves in a position where the working class, via the leadership of the Communist Party, can remove the ruling class from their positions of power. And that is the only way forward. Not around, but through. And that is a good point to end the episode on. So I will thank you to all of you who have tuned in tonight. I hope you found this an illuminating discussion of a thoroughly discredited system. I will be returning to you again tomorrow for an analysis of the results. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And the audio for this will be up on the Patreon site tomorrow. And there will be additional content following on Patreon on over the course of this weekend about Israel and Palestine. So I will return to you tomorrow, probably at the slightly earlier time of 7:30 or so, to analyze the horror show as the results pour in. So please join me again for that one. But now I'm going to throw you back over to a musical accompaniment.